Good morning. Today is September 13th, and it's 9 a.m. in the morning. All right, let's get started. So, we are going to read the discussion between student and the Chairman Bernanke. Student, in the previous lecture, you discussed that in the Depression, it seemed that policy was tightened too early, and that led to a double dip. And then today, we were discussing that policy in the 1970s was too slow to tighten. How do we know when the right time when the right time is and is there a right time, or does it vary all the time? Chairman Bernanke, it is challenging, and that is certainly one of the reasons that the Fed has so many economists and models and everything to try to figure out what the appropriate moment is to tighten or to ease policy. Forecasting is not very accurate, and so we have to keep looking at what is happening and make adjustments as we go along. The 1970s was particularly difficult because at that time inflation expectations were not at all tied down. If gas prices went up, then people began to expect higher inflation and then to demand higher wages to compensate for the higher prices. And then, of course, higher wages would feed into higher prices and so on. That was a result of the fact that everybody expected inflation to go up. Nobody had any confidence that the Fed or the government in general would keep inflation low and stable. We have a very different situation now, fortunately, and this owes a lot to Chairman Volcker and to Chairman Greenspan as well. After a long period of low inflation, most people are pretty comfortable that inflation will stay reasonably low despite the fact that there are ups and downs with gas prices and so on. That helps a lot because with inflation staying low, the Fed has more leeway. If policy is easy for a period, that is not necessarily going to feed into a wage price spiral that would create a much bigger inflation problem down the road. So keeping inflation expectations low and stable is one of the great accomplishments of Chairman Volcker and Chairman Greenspan, and it is an important objective of central banks around the world. Student, I have a question about the low interest rate monetary policy in the early 2000s and your view with all the different research that was conducted, that it did not spark the housing bubble. If you had been Fed chair in 2001, would you have kept rates that low? Do you think it was the correct thing to do? Chairman Bernanke, I was on the Fed board during the time, and the very first speech I wrote when I became a governor in 2002 was about bubbles and financial supervision and regulation. The theme of my speech was use the right tool for the job. The problem with tying interest rate policy to perceived bubble and asset prices is that it is like using a sledge a sledgehammer to kill a mosquito. The problem is that housing is only one part of the economy, whereas interest rates are dedicated to achieving overall economic stability. So we estimate that in order to stop the increase in house prices, interest rates would have had to be raised very dramatically in a period when the economy was very weak. Unemployment was still above normal, inflation was falling toward zero, and generally speaking, the right way to use monetary policy is to achieve overall macroeconomic stability. Now, that does not mean you should ignore financial imbalances. I think that the Federal Reserve could have been more aggressive on the supervisory and regulatory side to make sure, for example, that the mortgages being originated were of better quality, that firms were appropriately monitoring their risks, and so on. So I think the first line of defense should be regulation and supervision. One of the lessons I talked about today was not to be too sure of anything, to be humble. For that reason, I think we should never rule out the possibility that if all of our regulatory and other types of interventions do not achieve the stability and the financial system we want, monetary policy might, as a last resort, be modified to some extent to deal with that problem. But again, because monetary policy is such a blunt tool which affects all asset prices and affects the entire economy, if you can get a laser focused type of tool, that is going to be much better for everybody. At the end of the lecture, you mentioned the role of the global imbalances played in creating the housing bubble. Doesn't the current US monetary and fiscal policy, which focuses on boosting consumption through borrowing more, doesn't that lead us down the same road of overconsumption through borrowing that got us into the crisis in the first place? First, Chairman Bernanke, first, we would like to get a better balance in general. So monetary policy stimulates capital formation as well. It also tends to promote exports. So we would like to get a better balance of consumption, investment, and exports, as well as government spending. Those are the main components of demand. So current monetary policy is consistent with a better balance. That being said, consumer demand is now far below where it was before the crisis. Consumer spending has not recovered. It is still quite weak relative to where it was before the crisis. Private debt has come down quite a bit, and you mentioned global imbalances. So we are talking about the current account imbalance or the trade deficit that the United States has. It has come down quite significantly. So all those things have moved, if anything, too far in the short run because we lack a source of demand to keep the economy growing. I agree that every country needs to have an appropriate balance of consumption, capital formation, exports, and government spending, and that is an important task for us. But right now, debt and consumption and so on are still quite low relative to the pattern before the crisis. Student, the latter part, the latter part of your lecture was about the monetary policy in the 2000s after the dot-com bubble and how interest rates were kept low. We argued that that was not a trigger to the increase in house prices, but to look at it from another point of view. What is your take on the argument that the low interest rates caused private investors and banks to make riskier trades, and that could have been a trigger to the crisis? Chairman Bernanke, that is a good question. I think that there is some effect of low interest rate on risk taking, but once again, it is an issue of getting the right balance. During a recession, generally speaking, on most dimensions, investors become very cautious. That is certainly where they have been for much of the recent past. You want to achieve an appropriate balance between the amount of risk being taken, not too much, not too little. And once again, this is yet another reason why financial supervision and regulation needs to be playing a role. Particularly with large institutions, banks, we need to be looking directly at those firms and making sure that they are managing their risks appropriately. So, again, it is a question of the right tool for the job. The graphs on the housing bubble show how clearly one thing led to another, like rising prices and then eventually a fall. When you were observing the economy in the 2000s, what did you think happened to the rising house prices in the housing bubble? Did you think that it would eventually lead to a recession? There is a book called The Big Short about some investors who were very prescient in shorting the market. What is your take on that? Chairman Bernanke, as I tried to argue, the decline in house prices by itself was not obviously a major threat. In 2005, when I was the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors for President George W. Bush, we did an analysis for him on what would happen if house prices came down. We concluded that we would have a recession, but we did not anticipate that the decline of house prices would have such a broad-based effect on the stability of the financial system. When I became chairman of the Federal Reserve in 2006, house prices were already declining. In the first 2 weeks after I became chairman, I gave testimony in which I said, house prices are falling. That is going to have negative impacts on the economy, and we are not sure of all the consequences. So we were always aware of possibility that house prices might come down. The really hard thing to anticipate fully was that the effects of the decline in house prices would be so much more severe than the effects of the somewhat similar decline in dot-com stocks. And again, the reason is the way in which the decline in house prices affected mortgages, which affected the soundness of the financial system and created a panic, which in turn led to the instability of the financial system. So the whole chain of events was critical. It was not just the decline in house prices, it was the whole chain. So market correlation was a problem, I guess. And structured products. How to manage such risk, that's an issue.